At least I got back to where I was. Progress.
He tweets about the machines taking.
Check this work.
Awesome. Yeah, we got one.
You want to also record my audio just in case?
That's it.
And I'm 1 minute.
I can't believe you learned that in like, if you screw out everyone you know.
Okay. Now, okay. Is there an echo? No echo? Okay, good. As of now, it's good. Uh-oh. Now I need to start this. Okay. So knock on fake wood, we might be okay today. We will see. I don't know. Somebody is monitoring, right? Karthik is monitoring. You said. Okay. So if there is crazy audio, let me know. So you notice, as I said, to be able to talk face to face, there has to be some other guy who is looking at us from Zoom land to figure out whether or not the audio is okay. That's the level of technology that we have got into. So a couple of quick things. Please, I know that many of you haven't been really following Piazza. Some of you are, some of you aren't. You cannot survive this course without following Piazza. Please understand that. Okay, somebody actually asked me, it would be nice if I put the deadlines on the canvas. We are making the deadlines come there. But deadlines is like the least of the problems in this class, right? I mean, that's important, but there's a whole bunch of additional discussion that goes on Piazza. So if you're not following it, you're basically you're missing most of the things. And I'm not going to put everything on, canvas. That was the whole reason of Piazza. So make sure that you do use Piazza. We will make some of the deadlines, etc., be visible on the canvas, but I request that you pay attention as much as possible to Piazza. By the way, I don't want to show you right now, but on Piazza, I get statistics of how many times have you logged on, how many posts have you read, all those statistics. So I know that some of you actually, at least one person I even sent a mail saying, hey, you did not even log into Piazza, you're in the class, what are you doing? So please understand that if you don't do that, then it's not going to be very useful for you. Okay. The other thing is starting today, when you speak up, identify yourself, say your name. Okay. I want to be able to, I mean, normally 30 people, I should be able to figure out who is who. But then 30 people with masks on is like 900 people because there are lots and lots of people who look just like the same with the mask on. So I think we will try. I have your pictures in front of me, so I'll try to face complete. Actually, there are people who are in, I think in some other countries, like in Japan and so on, they're sort of printing personalized masks, which will have the rest of your face on the mask. So that I know. Okay. But here they're using the creativity to put like cat mouths and dog mouths on the mask instead of their own faces. So that's unfortunate. Okay. We will start now. As I said, how many of you have actually looked at all the either the videos that I asked you to look at or the alternatively look at the readings? Okay. Those of you who didn't, please understand that I'll assume that you have done because to respect the people who spend the time, I'll assume that everybody has watched. Okay. Those of you who showed up without, in essence, you'll just have to catch up with things. That's about it. Okay. I asked people if there are any questions on what they have read. And there were 2 people who spoke up. I understand that next time onwards, what I'll do is, so typically, here's the good news. I won't make you watch anything between now and Thursday. Okay, that's hard. But I'll always make you watch things between Thursday and next Tuesday because there is a weekend. Unless there's some crazy deadline from my class. There will be crazy deadlines from other classes for you, but I can't help that. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. So anyway, I did ask, next time onwards, I'll remember to do this. Can I ask you to see the videos? I'll also open a Q&A thing where you can ask questions, things that didn't make sense to you. And I'm happy to, that's the point. I want to pick those and go over them before going to the next topic and so on. Okay, we'll see how this goes. So before I go forward, I wanted to make sure that we did this environment type. So today, basically, I'm going to talk about environment types a little bit, which I think you read, but I didn't say it formally in the class. It turns out that actually the name, the type, the properties of the environments are extremely important in terms of what sort of algorithms are needed for what sort of environment. And one of the things we want to understand is we will start with like the easiest environments up front, and that's still pretty hard. And then we'll slowly start making the environment more and more realistic, more and more harder. Okay. So just for that, I want to just walk you through them once. I'm sure that you had to read it in one of the earlier classes, but I didn't mention it in the class here. And then we will do the review of all the blind search strategies. So I noticed that there's a whole bunch that those videos covered. You wound up talking about what is a problem-solving agent. You also saw things about uninformed search in general, or what's called blind search. And I think the most interesting part, those of you who have done 310 may have heard of breadth first and depth first search. That's not surprising. The cute thing was this iterative deepening searches, iterative deepening depth first search. And I will mention a little bit more about that. And then we went into uniform cost search, which the last time in 310, you may have heard of it as Dijkstra search. How many of you know the name Dijkstra? Okay. Dijkstra search is uniform cost search on graphs. Okay? And then we will go, and then towards the very end of that second lecture, I was saying, it would be nice if there is some sort of a rich uncle who told you where you are when you are at a particular state, how far you are to the goal node. If they were there, then you can do search much faster. Okay? While nobody will have a perfect uncle, perfect rich uncle who gives exactly what's called H star, which is the exact distance from that node to the closest goal node. This is, by the way, something that we need to understand. In many scenarios, there may be multiple goal nodes. When you're talking about the heuristic cost, you're asking from this node, whatever is the closest goal node, what is the distance to it? That's what H star n is supposed to give you. And I try to argue that if you get H star n, things will be good. You'll do search faster. But if you can't get H star n, I tried to end the lecture. The only reason I remember this is it's not that I remember what I said 2 years back. I also watched quick parts of the lecture just to make sure that what I have made you watch. So I remember. So basically, the end I pointed out that everybody has an uncle, maybe a taciturn uncle, who doesn't speak up. So if you ask them how far, so you say 0. Basically, that means every node is 0 away from the goal node. That's the heuristic they give you. If they give that heuristic, then in essence, you are doing Dijkstra search. Do you see what I'm saying? Because the idea is that you are trying to do search by F values, which is G plus H. G being the cost to the node, H is the approximate, what you think is the cost to the goal. G, you know for sure. In life, you know how far you have walked if you kept track. You don't know how far you have left to go. That's where the estimates come. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if in fact H is 0, that is a very poor estimate. So between H equal to 0 and H equal to H star, pretty much any heuristic is better than H equal to 0. That's where I ended. In fact, I think I also ended by reminding you that in general, you sometimes can get heuristic estimate information by abstracting the problem, by removing all the constraints from the problem and seeing what is the distance, what is the distance to the goal. And you can be sure that when you put the constraints back in, the real distance can only be longer than the abstract distance. So the way I abstracted it in that lecture, if I remember correctly, is I wanted to, let's say I'm doing path planning, which is a kind of search problem, right? So I needed to reach, let's say, one person there. And honestly, right now I need to make sure that I don't bump into anything. I need to find the optimal path, which sort of, without bumping into tables, I will reach that person. That I may not know the exact distance. But if I act as if the entire class disappeared, except that person, so class disappearing means the tables also disappeared. And only that person is there. Then I know that the straight line distance from me to that person is guaranteed to be a lower bound. It will be a lower bound on whatever is the real distance. Do you guys understand this? This lower boundness is extremely important. Lower bound is what makes the H be below H star. H star is the true cost. If your uncle is way too optimistic, they keep saying, yeah, you just have 0 distance. Just keep going, you just have 0 distance. If they give a lower bound distance, that's better than 0, but less than H star. And you can show that if you then use that G plus H as the F value, which is the value for the priority queue, the queue of all the nodes in the search queue, on the open list so you have open list of search nodes. They all have some number by which you are sorting them. In the case of uniform cost search, you sorted them by G value. In the case of this A star search, when you have G plus H, you call it A star search, you sort it by F value. F is G plus H. In fact, this search queue idea can also make sense in understanding breadth first and depth first. In the case of breadth first, G exists. The idea of thinking about breadth first is you can imagine each edge between any two search nodes, assume its cost 1. The actual uniform cost, that means everybody has the same cost. Okay? In that case, then the G value to a node, so the depth of a node, basically, will be its G value. The depth of the node will be its G value. So if you do the priority queue in terms of G, you will get breadth first search. If you do priority queue in terms of minus of G, that is minus of depth, you get depth first search. So it's the same idea. You always, all search algorithms have like a queue of nodes, and each of those nodes have some metric. Generally, we'll assume it's F value. F is the most general merit of the node. And that F can be written as just G, can be written as G plus H. It can be written as depth, where G becomes depth. You can also write it as minus of G, minus of depth, and that would be depth first search. And by the way, while I was going through this, I kind of made this strange comment that if all the costs of the edges are actually 1, which is when you will call that search a uniform cost search, truly speaking, right? Because every cost is 1. But we called Dijkstra's algorithm uniform cost search. It makes no sense. But that's what people decided to call it. It's one of those crazy, nonsensical names. Sometimes names have nothing to do with what the semantics are supposed to be. So it's very useful for you to remember that uniform cost search has non-uniform edge costs. Isn't that crazy? It's worthwhile remembering that. You will see these kinds of random things in general in science. People will misname something and they'll just stick to it. Okay? Okay, so we will talk about that, and then basically, what I did in this last 10, 15 minutes is to the end of A star search, essentially, which is where the heuristics come from. Heuristics come from the abstractions. And then what I'll do in today's class is quickly sort of answer any questions, including the 2 that people had on the Piazza about the stuff that you have seen, and then go into A star search discussion. But before that, I did want to do this environment types quickly. Okay. Are there any questions before I go forward? Okay. So in the case of environment types, basically, this is my pink robot. I made this, God knows when, maybe 1990 sometime. So the pink robot essentially has an effector. And the effector basically hands, legs, things that it can change the environment with. It has sensors, things it can use to get the state of the environment, get some property of the environment. It has some performance metric. The general performance metrics can be very general. We will talk about things like reward metric later on. But for now, we'll assume performance metric is reaching some goal. Like if you reach a state where the goal is satisfied, you get some points. And what this agent is trying to do is trying to figure out what must my next action be. Do an action, and then again look at the environment, see if it's already in the goal state. If not, figure out what's the next action, do the action, and keep doing this until it reaches the goal. And it does have a brain, and the brain is the one that makes sure that it comes up with the best next action, given everything it knows about the problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? Anybody can do a random action. If I know what sort of, kids basically just randomly do things. And also, you also do the same thing. Like if I take you in front of some, like very complex, like a nuclear reactor control room or the flight control cockpit, and say, yeah, go do stuff. Just try. You don't know what to do. I mean, especially if, in fact, you are on that flight and the flight is about to fall down, you need to do something to stop it from falling down. You will try a bunch of things. And by the way, oftentimes some of those crazy things do work. I mean, what is the most important way to make a computer work? Give it a big hit or switch it on and off. These actions have no semantics, but sometimes they have enough generic effects that it seems to kind of make things work. We try random things like that. But most of the time, we actually want the agent to think carefully about what it knows about the world. Remember that intelligent agent architecture, it has an idea of how the world moves, how its actions affect the world, all this information it has. Using that information and using the state of the world, it figures out what's the best action. That's what how to do that is basically the very first idea of how to do that is a problem-solving agent. In fact, somebody asked a question, where are all these, depth first blind searches? Why is it relevant to AI? Well, under certain conditions that we'll see in a minute, figuring out what is the next best action winds up doing a search on the graph. And that graph search can be a blind search or informed search, depending on how much you have. This thing is going on by itself. Good. Okay, so anyway, so basically the pieces that I want you to remember is when I am doing actions, I can have actions be either the most important, deterministic or stochastic. Deterministic means the agent knows that when it does this action, a specific effect will happen with 100% certainty. That is 1.0 probability. Stochastic means it does this action with some probability, some effects will happen, some other probability, some other effects will happen. Okay? In general, if I tell you everything else being equal, if I give you two problems, everything else in these problems is the same, except in this problem, you have deterministic actions. In this problem, you have stochastic actions. Which would you rather, and I say, pick a problem that you would be solving. It doesn't matter which one, I just want to see whether you are able to solve the problem. Which one would you pick? Deterministic, because it's easier to reason about deterministic actions. But most of the time, so in general, this sort of orange stuff is what you would prefer for every one of these dimensions, and the yellow stuff is what you get in real world. Okay, so because it's a class, you get to make assumptions. And in the beginning, we'll assume that all the orange stuff is true for our agent. And then we'll slowly start making each of these oranges into yellows. That will be more and more general. Okay, so then, even though you may not think about it, actions can be either instantaneous or durative. That means I do this action, right away the effect occurs. That's a good thing. In fact, if you can get instant gratification, those actions are easier. You see something, and then try something else. Imagine if when you do an action, the effect can only be recognized later over a period of time. Have you seen actions that have durations in life? Most of our actions have durations, right? In fact, what's his name? Powell is trying to control economy. Powell is an intelligent agent. You know who I'm talking about? Powell is the Fed chairman. You guys have money? I mean, if you have money, you need to think about economics and stuff, right? So Fed is, Powell is the Fed chairman, and he's trying to control the economy, trying to make sure that we don't go into depression, or we don't go into, not depression in the psychological sense, depression, economic depression, or economic recession, or all this stuff. He has a couple of little actions that he can do, such as increasing interest rates, reducing interest rates, printing more money, all that stuff. He does one of these things, he can't right away see whether the economy improved or not. He has to wait for a whole bunch of time to see if the economy improved. So what do? Every 3 months they meet. They say, let's do this. And then come back 3 months later and then try to see, did it work? Oh, it didn't work, let's do something else. That's the way real life is. You don't even have to be Fed chairman. Everything that you do, like, for example, you did the action of taking this course. The outcome will only be known 4 months later, right? So most of the life is actually durative actions, but instantaneous actions are so much more fun to work with, easier to work with. So we'll assume that in the beginning, we'll assume that the problems are having instantaneous actions. Then coming to this side, the environment itself, it can be static versus dynamic. Static essentially means when you're thinking, the environment waits for you. And when you do an action, it changes the state of the environment. That is static. Dynamic means the environment has its own life. If you don't do an action, it still will be changing. What will be happening is the thing that you're doing might change the evolution of the states through which it goes. Do you see what I'm saying? Clearly, which one is easier to handle? Static. Because when I'm thinking, if the world stops, it would be great. How is the world like? I'm sorry, you only have one lifetime in which to both think and do. You see what I'm saying? So if you kind of wait until 99 years to figure out what's the best way to live, and then, okay, now I'm ready to start living, you die. You see what I'm saying? Because time is over. Okay? So in general, basically, dynamic worlds are the most of the time. So, a much simpler thing is standing in the middle of University Avenue and trying to figure out, should I go left? Should I go right? That, unfortunately, doesn't stop the cars. So, people who are assuming the University Avenue is static and they're making decisions, they no longer exist because they've been run over by buses. Okay? So if you make assumptions about the environment that are not true, you might die. And dying is just a generalized way of performing less. You see what I'm saying? When your performance is lower, the worst performance is you die. Because after that, you don't get any points. Right? So, but you can do inoptimal in behavior. And that can also happen in terms of if you make assumptions about the environment that actually are not realistic. But all agents may have to make assumptions about environments because real world environments are essentially all yellow. And you can't deal with yellow. So you have to kind of make some number of orange assumptions and a few yellow assumptions. Okay, that's static versus dynamic. By the way, one way of dynamic is other animate agents, other processes. So for example, if the plane is falling because it ran out of fuel, if you don't do anything, if you say, let me think what is the best action to do, the plane will reach the ground, typically with a big thud. You're dead. Okay? But if you are then trying to control the plane, what you're doing is you're changing. So there is a process that the plane already follows. It's a natural process. And the plane doesn't care about the fact that you are in it. It's basically nature doesn't care about you. Nature will just say, if you put stuff in the air and doesn't have other forces acting on it, gravity will act on it and the damn thing will fall. All you can then do is the agent can do actions to kind of oppose the process. Such as you start the engine, you put the thrusters, you make the plane go up, all that stuff. That's one way you deal with, that's one kind of dynamism. The other kind of dynamism is there are other agents, other animate agents. And they basically sometimes want to help you, sometimes might want to make you fail. The world is full of people who help you, but it's also full of people who make you fail. In those guys' cases, it's personal. Nature doesn't care about you. Your opponents specifically care about you. And they know exactly what weaknesses you have and then try to exploit them. Do you understand this? So my example to remember, so of these two dynamic scenarios, one is other animate agents, other is other processes. So you get a chance to go to a planet where you are the only animate person to solve a problem. Or you can go to this other planet where you are there as well as some other Star Trek people are there. Which one is easier? In some sense, if you are on the Star Trek land, you need to deal with these other animate agents who might be modeling you, who might be sometimes trying to help you, sometimes trying to hurt you. So then you need to not only model the environment, you need to model your opponents, the people on the other side. It's a harder problem in general. So my joke example for this, so that you would never forget the difference between a dynamic environment where it's just the nature making the environment go from state to state versus a dynamic environment where there are other agents who might be trying to help you or who might be trying to hurt you. The difference is, remember the Death Star in Star Wars? Remember for design considerations and aesthetics, they made this huge Death Star and they put this one little place which is vulnerable. The entire thing, I don't know how many of you have seen, by the way, the Family Guy episode where this thing is discussed. If somebody reminds me, I'll send a link. It's just lovely. So you have to think about this. Who is this bozo who designed Death Star and made this one place which is vulnerable? So if you throw in a bomb there, the whole thing blows up. Most of the time, by a random asteroid hitting, Death Star going out of existence, the probability of that is extremely low because asteroids don't model opponents. It's a random event. But the probability that Harrison Ford will go directly to the only little place where there is vulnerability is 1.0. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, it's like if you are trying to save your home from like falling debris, right? If you kind of put, a bunch of roof, like a very, reinforced roof, most of your home, but in one place you forget to put it, it's okay. This most likely it's not going to hit there. If on the other hand, you're trying to save it from debris that are falling because somebody is throwing stones at your home, you have complete false sense of security because they know that that's the one place where you haven't reinforced. So they won't waste time throwing stones at the rest of the house. They'll just throw stone at that place. In fact, every mythology, every human mythology is full of these kinds of situations where some mythological character thinks they became invincible, but there is one little thing that they left open. And nature would have left them alone, but their opponents won't. Because opponents model you. So you better model the opponents. Yes?
The hole in like the Death Star, that's like a movie to explain that.
Did you move it to explain that?
Yeah, they made a whole movie about that.
Yeah, but I mean, they made it up, obviously. So, I mean, there could be reasons, obviously. There could be reasons, obviously. There are all sorts of interesting, these kinds of mythology stories. But it's like, the point, of course, is in some cases, I mean, I'm making this example up, I'm bringing this example to you to make you remember that you should be worried not about nature, but about other people, other animate people, or maybe robots, if the robots become intelligent enough. Because nature is not out to get you. Okay? Yes.
So, continuing with the Death Star example, but that one hole is also something that the designer is aware of, potential source of danger to the Death Star. So would that not be bad design to assume nature is not going to hurt you?
No, because the point is the probability. Imagine assuming if you take the usual calculations, there's a surface area of the Death Star, and the percentage of the surface area which is vulnerable is some very small percentage. So the probability that a randomly hitting asteroid will actually hit on the vulnerable spot is basically the ratio of the vulnerable area by the total area. Whereas the probability that Harrison Ford will hit you is 1.0. It doesn't say, oh, no, these guys went through this whole trouble of making most of it a hard-to-break thing. Let me just give them some benefit of doubt by trying to hit the good parts, not the other parts. We don't do that.
I think my question is that could you not consider other processing beings to be a part of the environment? Just assume that as a default. Rather than solving for each potential agent as not a part of the environment, could you not assume
some things that you tend to do, if this is what you're trying to get at, is one person is an enemy. A mob, on the other hand, you just think of the mob. You don't necessarily assume that the mob has time to opponent model you. So when there's a mob, then you basically do the mob process. Whereas you have one particular person, you probably might want to see what do they know about you and what are they likely to basically exploit. By the way, another example, Death Star example is one idea. Another example is think of the worldwide internet. There are hubs in the internet, global hubs, some big companies, right? Okay, and the big companies, essentially, most of the traffic will go through that. Okay, versus a world where it's completely peer-to-peer. There's no big companies. Traffic just sort of goes between every pair of nodes through any possible path. That's called a randomly connected network versus a clustered network with hubs in the middle. We live in the world with the hubs. The world with hubs is actually good in one way. Random perturbations are less likely to kill the network. Because random perturbations are less likely to kill the Death Star because there's only a very small part that is vulnerable. Most of the time, asteroids will be hitting all these other places. But on the other hand, if there is adversarial attack, remember denial of service attacks? Why didn't anybody do a denial of service attack on your computer? Did you understand what I'm saying? I mean, like every time they say Amazon, Bezos say, oh my God, we were in DOS attack. And Sony says we were in DOS attack. Some other big company says in DOS attack. How come we are not getting DOS attacked? You're too small a fish. You don't matter. It's not worth wasting time doing denial of service on you. If I do a denial of service on the hub node, then a huge number of network, huge part of the network will go down. I mean, the reason I'm doing this is really to bring down the network. And so that is what basically people do. And so we live in a world which we developed where, in fact, we have Death Star-like vulnerabilities. Because that allows some advantages. Random perturbations, you'll be more robust with respect to random perturbations. But at the same time, you will be more vulnerable to opponents. And it's very important for you to understand this because there is generally people tend, in fact, the way we will develop this stuff, we will look at the distinction between stochastic versus adversarial. And adversarial search, basically people model you and see what's the worst thing that can happen to you, and that's the action they will pick. Did you see what I'm saying? Okay. So then the other thing about observable environment is observable versus partially observable versus non-observable. That basically means how much of the state of the environment is actually the environment sending out. And then this partial observability is kind of connected also to the sensors, perfect versus imperfect sensors. So for example, this room, if I'm thinking of the state of this room in terms of where everybody is sitting, is it an observable environment or not? Is it an observable environment? Yes. To me, because I still have eyes. Once in a while, I kind of fog up, so I remove my glasses. Now, if you ask me, is this observable? No, kind of blurry environment. If somebody who is visually challenged, who is partially blind, comes into this environment, what was fully observable to me is partially observable to them. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this is actually just alternative. So this is actually the technical way you have to think about how is the life harder. I mean, I brought this up earlier too. How is life harder for people who are basically missing some senses like deafness and blindness, etc. Because they can't see the state of the world. And in general, if there is an uncertainty in the state of the world, you have to assume it is in one of many possible states. And then you have to then try to deal with transitioning these sets of states into other sets of states, which is a much harder problem. And in fact, you can think of it in a different way, which is if there are n states, and it's in a fully observable environment, an agent which is searching for the goal in that will have to do at most n search, because it needs to look at every state to see what is the goal node. But if there are n states, and they are partially observable environment, that means what you're seeing is a blurry world, essentially. So you can't be too sure exactly which state of the world you are in. So when you look at the world, what you get is a subset of the possible worlds that are consistent with what you are seeing. If there are n states, so n individual states, how many subsets of the states are there? What? Did everybody understand what this guy just said? By the way, this is how things go out of kilter. Okay, my joke is that if a computer science kid wakes up cold sweat in the middle of the night, it's because they dreamt of 2 power n. That's the devil. You see what I'm saying? 2 power n is like exponentially bigger than n. And in fact, the number of subset of a set of n elements is 2 power n. So when you are searching in a fully observable environment by searching over n search states and search nodes, you're partially, your friend who may not be able to see the world as well is in essence, in the worst case, searching a search space that is 2 power n. So if they do just as well as you should feel in awe of them because they have a much better working brain. You see what I'm saying? Okay. One other last thing is, what sort of goals do you have? You can have goals of achievement, which is mostly what I was saying, reach some place. In fact, in the beginning of this class, we will look at goals of achievement. But you could also have generalized goals. You can have lots and lots of goals, and I say try to achieve as many of them as possible. Okay, in general, in the most general case, every state of the world you go through, you get a reward. Either you can get like a nice little dopamine rush, or you get a dopamine low. And what you, as the happy, like an intelligent agent, is trying to do is to come up with a policy that maximizes the total amount of dopamine rush. And I'm saying this deliberately because I know that you can do wireheading, which is, if all I care about is dopamine rush, I'll get some drugs, take them. I don't need to do anything. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, that's exactly how we get addicted, because our intrinsic reward metrics are like connected to dopamine rushes. So to the extent you somehow think, wow, I love this lecture, somehow, due to some problem in your genetics, you have connected a good lecture to dopamine rush. Or I'm hoping that I can rewire your head that it would happen that way. Okay, so in all these cases, as I said, all the oranges are the easy ones, all the yellows are the hard ones, and what you get are basically, if you have all yellows, that's the worst possible problem that you have to deal with. And the one that you have to look at, that you looked at last in the lectures, is problem-solving agent, where in essence what it is assuming is it's assuming static world, deterministic, fully observable, and instantaneous actions. And goals of achievement. So problem-solving agent is all orange. This is the simplest case you can start with. So with respect to why are so many different search algorithms, those algorithms are all essentially trying to solve this one orange agent's problem of what should be my next action. Okay, there was a question earlier. Did I answer that? You still have it?
I wanted to ask you about observability.
What?
I wanted to ask about observability.
About what?
Observability.
Okay.
So is the observability of an environment dependent on, or like correlated to the accessibility of the environment as a whole? Because like, for example, if you were to drop a wall in the middle of the classroom so that you're completely blocked from that side, is the classroom now partially?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Or is
So it is true that things that happen in the environment, or even the things that you do, can change the observability. So if in fact you want your opponent across the street, your neighbor opponent across the street, not to know where you are in the room because they once in a while try to shoot you, you will build a wall outside your home so that behind the wall you are and they can't see you. Then they will think smart and they'll put some kind of an apple dot on you so they know where you are still. This is an, arms race between you and your observer. But yes, actions, you can, putting things like walls, etc., change the observability. And more interestingly, sometimes observability is very much dependent on the kind of sensors you have. Okay, if any of you, do you now have COVID antibodies? You can't just look like this and say, do I have it? No. In fact, between January last year to up until like May last year, we didn't know how to check that. So at that point of time, it was that particular property of your body was unobservable. Then we developed these cheap tests. First, the very costly test, then a little less costly test. Now, tons and tons of tests. They're like devil drop or whatever you can go to and just give a saliva, and they'll tell you whether or not you have, basically you have infection. So you develop a new sensor. Tests are sensors. And the other very interesting thing is these type of things are actually like, rabbit holes. Sometimes you go to a doctor, you say, I have my runny nose, blah, blah, blah. They can just say, take Tylenol and go home. Or they can say, hey, maybe I should do more tests on you. And even more tests, and even more tests. The more tests they do, the more perfect information they get about your body. Plus, they also get more money. That is, the labs will get more money. An optimal strategy in some cases would be do only so much testing and then start treating. But then given all the incentives, for example, in US in particular, doctors are likely to be sued if they are ever wrong. So you are not treating the patient. You're trying to stop the lawsuit. So when I came back, back in July, I went to Orlando, I came back, and I got a common cold. I didn't know what common cold is because for the last 1 year, we were all sitting at home. None of us got any kind of infections. And then it didn't go away. So I didn't know. These days, if you sneeze, you assume you have to reach the COVID ICU, right? Intensive ward. So then I went to my doctor. I first actually got lots and lots of tests done, and then I went to the doctor. And they said, yeah, looks, it's probably okay, go home. 1 week later, again, I got that fever back. So I went back. This time, he did every possible test that can be done. I kind of basically lost about 3 liters of blood because there are lots and lots of tests that we done. All tests came fine. And he said, you're fine. Why did he do that? Because possibly because maybe I have something. And secondly, since I went back second time, if he didn't do all the tests, if I were to croak, somebody can sue them. It's a very different, complex, thing in terms of testing. So anyway, that's about the problem-solving agent here. So you basically assume that the way this agent is dealing with the world, as I said, is that it knows its state, and it has a child generator function that tells it what other state it can reach by doing what actions. And it's in a deterministic world, so the child generator function says if you do A1, you'll get into S1. If you do A2, you'll get into S2, etc. One of these states down there is a goal state. Some of these states are goal states. And it's trying to figure out what actions should it do, the sequence of actions it should do, such that it will reach the goal state. This is what you studied in those lectures. Whoever asked the question, hopefully this sort of gives some idea as to why those algorithms were being studied. The other thing that I mentioned is, in terms of the search algorithms, they differ based on the specific queuing function they use. I already mentioned it. You put all the search nodes into an open list, and then pick the best in terms of some priority metric. Okay? The other thing that I want you to remember is all search algorithms must do goal tests as soon as the node is picked up for expansion. Only when the node is picked up for expansion, not when the node comes into the open list. Because all the proofs of optimality depend on you pick the node just before expanding it. You test it, is it a goal node? If you do that, all the proofs that you studied that basically will hold about optimality. If not, all bets are off. Okay? The summary, okay, actually before going into the summary, this is a summary of what you read, but before going to the summary, one more thing here is the difference between problem state versus search node. a problem state, for example, could be, remember, we now are talking about a very specific problem, such as the 8 puzzle. The problem state in 8 puzzle could be the exact matrix configuration of where is each of the tiles, including the blank tile. You see what I'm saying? And whereas a search node basically is actually a data structure during the search algorithm. You can get to the same world state, same problem state in different paths. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you have to assume that the node has a pointer to the world state. There can be another search node that also has a pointer to this world state. This is how actually even on finite graphs, search algorithms can go into infinite loops because they're going to cycle. They're getting new search nodes every time, but all of them are basically talking about the same set of states. And there's a whole lot of other set of states that are outside the other side that you're not looking at. Okay? So anyway, so somebody asked me to say depth first, breadth first, IDDFS. I'll just do it on these examples, just quickly to make sure that you understand. So this is some kind of a graph. There are 2 goal nodes here, H and F. So if I'm doing breadth first search, I will start by initializing the queue with, I'll just say node 1, A. Node 1 with, which corresponds to A. Then I come back, I looked at the open list and say whichever is the front of the open list. Okay? And alternately, you can assume that you sort open list in terms of depth. That means the lowest depth first. Okay? Then you'll pick up A and you check, is it a goal node? I told you only F and H are goal nodes, goal states. So it's not. So you expand it, you get B and C. So from the open list, you remove N1 and you put N2B, N3C. Okay? Now, notice that I just put N2B first and N3C next. In general, you could have put N2C and 3B because all the children are considered equally valid, equal. Also, they're all from the same depth, so even by priority, they're all equal. This sort of tells you that many of the proofs are modulo equally good nodes. Okay, if there are multiple goals that are equally good, if I give you one of those goals, paths to one of those goals, then I'm optimal. Okay, so then at this point, I'll pick N2B, okay, because it is there in the front. I mean, ties are broken arbitrarily. Let's assume I break the ties left to right, okay. So I take N2B, and that's still not a goal node. Then I expand it. I get N4D, N5E, and then still N3C is there. Except that, remember, in fact, the way I should have put this is that it's a queue. I mean, either you have to think of it as a queue. That means the guys who are coming have to go to the back of the queue. So really what I should have done is that the thing goes behind it. Next, then I'll pick up N3C, and then I'll get F1G. Okay, so then I will, so then I'll get N3C, I'll get F1G. So then N4D, N5E, N6F, N7G. At that point, you will take N4D and realize it's not goal, and you try to expand it. It has no children, so it's just basically just goes away. It leaves no footprint. Then you then pick E. It has children. It has children, and it has, so you have N5 E. So N5E has been removed now. So we are looking at N6F, N7G, N8H, N9I, and 10J. At that point, you realize that N8H is on the open list and it's a goal node. We say success and stop. Right? No. I'm trying to wake you up. Okay. Because I just said before this slide that you don't declare success prematurely. Just because it's on the open list doesn't mean you're done. Only when you pick it up for expansion are you done. If you declared now, you would have been in trouble. Okay, in fact, if you're declaring now, you could have declared earlier too, when N7 came in. But then eventually you pick N6, and N6F has, when you pick N6F, before you expand it, you check if it is goal. It says, yes, you are goal. Then you say, done. So in essence, what you did is you traversed level by level by level. Or you're using depth as the priority metric, then the shallower nodes are expanded before the deeper nodes. Because of which, even if in fact this search tree is infinitely deep, it is infinitely deep, but it has goals at the finite depths. Breadth first search will terminate by finding them. That's the notion of completeness. Will the damn algorithm even terminate? It will terminate because as long as there are shallow goals, you will look at all the shallow depths before you go to the infinite depth. That's how you get the completeness. And you get the optimality because you're going depth by depth. Okay? That's it. The breadth first search, and I won't go into that much slow step by step for this. In general, what happens in the depth first search, you start with N1A, then you remove N1A, you put N2B, N3C. Up until this, it's all fine. Then you remove N2B, you get N4D, N5E, N3C. Basically, it's no longer a queue, it's a stack. Either you can think of it as a stack, or think of it as you are prioritizing the queue in terms of negative of depth. Not the depth, but the negative of depth. That's what depth first search does. And because of which, basically what happens is that depth first search, if in fact the leftmost branch goes infinitely deep, even though the rest of the tree is shallow and there are goals in the shallow depths, depth first search will die because it's going in that branch before coming this. That's basically what you remember from 3.10.2, right? And the other thing, of course, is even if there is no infinite depth branches, if in fact there is two different goals, so in this particular tree, what happens is it will find this goal. You can check this. It will find this goal because H would be earlier picked for expansion before F is ever picked for expansion. You know what is happening here, right? Charles, Prince Charles' kids, and their 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 kids get to be on the throne before Prince Charles' brother even has a fighting chance. This is primogeniture. That's depth first. Okay? So it looks like depth first is a dumb idea, right? Because you're not getting optimality. But it's actually one of the greatest ideas. The reason for that, as you talked about, is in terms of the complexity of the search, there are two kinds of complexities. One is the amount of time taken, which is the number of expansions. The other is the amount of space taken, which is the open queue, open list. And you have to remember that in terms of space, what matters is not average space, but is the maximum space that you will ever need. I keep reminding people that you have 32 gigabit RAM, and this thing is basically total memory of 32 gigabits, let's say, and your program requires just for 1 microsecond, 32 gigabytes plus 1 more byte. Most of the time, it doesn't require any. It'll be happy with 1 gigabyte. That 1 microsecond, it requires 32 gigabytes plus 1 byte. What happens to your program? Segmentation fault. Right? Space complexity basically is with respect to the maximum space you will ever need, not the average space. And in that context, breadth first search might wind up keeping the whole fringe at level n. Level D, the depth D. And if it's a uniform search tree, uniform branching tree, then the last level will have B power D nodes. Do you understand what I'm saying? The way you make breadth first search be the worst possible performance is to take a branching factor B depth D tree, put the goal node at the rightmost bottom. You might say, well, what if I put it in the leftmost bottom? It will still do B power D minus 1. Not B power D, but it will be doing B power D minus 1 expansions. The guy who can basically, if you're feeling lucky, don't use breadth first, because there is no such thing as luck in breadth first. If you're feeling lucky, use depth first. Because sometimes you can luck out if you put, for example, the goal in the rightmost, in the leftmost fringe, in the leftmost lower level. That means in a big tree like this, if you put your goal node here, depth first will just go there directly with the D expansions. The number of expansions that's equal to the amount of depth. D and B power anything, they are worlds apart. One is a number, one is just D, and the other is B power D. And what's most interesting is even if it is somewhere in between, even if it's not here, even if it's somewhere in between, depth first search will take B times D maximum space. Whereas breadth first search, that means its open list will never be bigger than B times D. Whereas basically breadth first search will take B power D. Okay? And then the other thing, of course, is how can I make depth first search at least complete? I can make depth first search complete essentially by limiting the depth. For example, suppose I put a line and said, don't look at the tree below this and see if you can find a goal node. That means, is there a goal node within depth 15? $15 will always be smaller than infinity. So you can never go off to infinitely deep branches. So if there is actually a goal node within this thing, you will find it. So it's complete, it will terminate. But it's still not optimal, because what if this was also a goal node? I'm sorry, actually, no, let's see, not that. There can be a situation where actually I have a goal node here, and I have a goal node here. And the depth is limited. So depth first search will find the goal node here first, even though there is another goal node there. So depth limited depth first search got you one advantage that breadth first search has, while keeping its original advantage of linear space, which is completeness. But it still didn't give you optimality. To give you optimality, what do? You essentially act as if this depth cutoff is starting at 0 and being incremented 1 unit at a time. You see what I'm saying? That means act as if the depth cutoff is 0, which essentially means if the root node is a goal node, I'm done. If not, the search fails. Then if the search fails, then you increase the depth limit by 1. So now it becomes level 1. Then I will do depth first search in level 1. If I find a goal, then I know it has to be optimal because there was no 0th level. I came to level 1. In general, I came to level k only because up to level k minus 1 tree, there are no goal nodes. So that gives you the proof that the first time it finds a goal node, it's optimal. But it is coming with a considerable extra work. It is doing iterations. Instead of just doing b power, a search in a tree of branching factor b and depth d, if you basically have a tree like this, it's in essence trying to first search this part, then search this part, then search this part, then search this part, then search this part, like that. So it's doing d iterations. And some nodes are being looked at repeatedly. It looks like a very dumb idea. But because you're talking about very large search trees, you can actually, the textbook points this out, that for the large values of B and D, the difference between IDDFS and DFS in terms of time is only like B plus 1 by B minus 1. This is the fun of large numbers. Because you do remember, even from your binary search trees, okay? Remember binary search trees? Suppose the search tree is of depth, the binary search tree is of depth 10. Up to depth 9, I counted the number of nodes I have. There are 512 of them. How many nodes are in the 10th level? What?
512.
512. You remember this. These uniform trees are bottom heavy. Each level essentially contains as many nodes as all the levels above it combined. So your intuitions fail. Your intuitions that this is a dumb idea actually fail because most of the nodes are sitting at the lower level. Yes?
I don't know, something that isn't super clear to me is what makes IDDFS better than just a breadth first search? Because when you describe it,
Because breadth first search will take exponential memory.
oh,
That's very important. Remember what Bill Gates said. Bill Gates said, nobody will ever need more than 8 kilobytes of memory. And in fact, I think just the name of his program takes more than 8 kilobytes these days. But that's the kind of thing we used to have. We basically, most of the time, your computers will have memory. You may have time. You may have nothing else to do, so you hang around with the computer. But if it seg faults, you're dead. So you're making it not seg fault by giving extra time doing redundant work. It's a very smart computer science idea. The last thing I want to do in the next 2 minutes which are left is to completely mess with your mind. And so remember we talked about uniform cast search, right? We'll skip all of this. We went through uniform cast search of this type, where there are different casts and so on. Why can't I do iterative deepening uniform cast search? Because uniform cost search is like breadth first search, essentially. That's why it's optimal. So it actually takes exponential space, even though it is optimal. Why can't can I not do iterative deepening depth first search on this graph? All you need to do is, because the costs are non-uniform, they can be any real number, essentially. They can be 0.001 as the edge cost. You can't think in terms of look at 0 level, then 1 level, then 2 levels, then 3 levels. You have to think in terms of cost cutoffs. You have to say, look for all the paths less than 0 units cost and see if there is a goal. If not, increment the cost cutoff by an epsilon. The question is, what is epsilon? The epsilon would be whatever is the closest node that crossed the cost cutoff. And you have to expand it by at least that, because if you are searching with nobody new coming, then you are dumb, because you're looking at the same tree again and again and again, hoping that some goal somehow came in. Some new node has to come in. So you have to expand the cutoff by epsilon, where epsilon is the first node that you saw, the node that's closest to the cutoff path length, but it's outside of it. And now if you make that as the new cutoff and you research the tree and you keep doing this, that would be called IDD-UCS. Uniform, iterative deepening, depth first uniform cost search. They didn't write about this in your book. In fact, a version of this they write much later called IDA star, which does the same thing except for the F value, not the G value. You see what I'm saying? And both of these do have the advantages that iterative deepening depth first search has, which is linear memory. But they're not anywhere near as good as IDDFS, because IDDFS, the number of iterations is upper bounded by the depth of the tree. The number of iterations of this guy and this guy, however, are upper bounded. What's the worst thing that can happen to an iterative guy like this? Every time one extra node comes in, every time you have to expand to just let one more guy in. So the number of nodes is B power D. So the number of iterations would be B power D, not D, but B power D. All of a sudden, this starts looking like a dumb idea. Do you see what I'm saying? Of course, the best case can happen to you where, in fact, the costs are all integral valued, and so it turns out that each time when you let one person in, a whole bunch of people come in. You open the door a little bit, bunch of people come in. Typically, that looks like a bad thing. When you open the door, more people come in. But in search, it's actually a good thing. Because if every time you open the door, only one more person comes in, then I have to look at all the guys in the room and say, are you goal, are you goal, are you goal, are you goal? And then I open the door, one more person comes in. I have to say the same thing. Are you goal, are you goal, are you goal? That's a dumb idea. That is IDS. We'll have to stop there.
Yeah, I know. I was actually working there.
The whole point is that we stop remembering where we are.